The grand ballroom was filled with the soft hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and laughter, a celebration of friendships that had endured 4 decades, but also an event tinged with whispers of curiosity and longing for the past. The 40th high school reunion of Hudson Heights Academy had drawn alumni from across the country, all of them reconnecting with old flames and friends, reliving their youth under glittering chandeliers. David Fletcher, now a well-respected attorney in his 60s, looked impeccable in his tailored suit. To anyone glancing his way, he seemed the model of stability and respectability. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, looked every bit the poised partner, exuding quiet elegance as she sipped her glass of Chardonnay. But Eleanor's smile had a brittle quality, and her gaze darted around the room, as if searching for something, or someone. This was no ordinary reunion for Eleanor. She had discovered, only weeks prior, the ugly secret that had been eating away at her husband's loyalty. David had reconnected with a high school sweetheart, a woman Eleanor had known only as the one who got away. Her name was Suzanne Wallace, now Suzanne Mercer, a name Eleanor had found scrawled in David's text messages, their tone far too familiar to be from a simple friend. Eleanor had felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and tonight she'd come determined to get the truth in the cold light of reality, or at least under the ballroom's blinding chandeliers. David's demeanor had been evasive, dodging her questions about whether Suzanne would attend the reunion, brushing off her probing glances with a casual laugh or a chaste kiss on her cheek. But Eleanor knew better than to fall for his act tonight. As the evening wore on, Eleanor quietly excused herself and drifted into the crowd, feigning interest in conversation with her husband's former classmates, many of whom she had never met. And then, just as she expected, she found David in a secluded corner of the ballroom, his hand resting lightly on the arm of a petite blonde with delicate features and an air of restrained confidence. Suzanne. She recognized her instantly from photos she had come across online. Eleanor observed them, hidden behind a column, watching as David leaned closer to Suzanne, his voice low, his expression unguarded in a way it rarely was with Eleanor. Her heart pounded with rage and sorrow, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was her moment. She took a deep breath and glided toward them, her face composed, but her eyes steely. David froze as he noticed her approach, his face paling, while Suzanne straightened, her smile fading into something uncertain and wary. "David," Eleanor said sweetly, her voice carrying a slight edge, "aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" David stumbled for words, caught off guard. "Ah, Eleanor, this is Suzanne. We were friends back in high school." "Friends," Eleanor repeated, the word sharp as glass. "Yes, I'm aware. You've always been so devoted to your old friends." A silence fell over the small trio, and the background hum of the reunion seemed to fade as eyes turned toward them. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Suzanne, who now wore a look of apprehension mingled with indignation. "Well," Eleanor continued, her voice a touch louder for effect, "I suppose now is as good a time as any to thank Suzanne personally for keeping my husband's spirits high over the past few months." David's mouth opened, but no words came out. Suzanne looked away, her cheeks tinged pink. Eleanor didn't relent. "I want to hear it from you, Suzanne. You've been with him, haven't you? All those work trips to the city, those late nights, were you with him?" Suzanne looked up, her lips parting in shock, but it was David who spoke, his voice filled with dread. "Eleanor, please. This isn't the place." But Eleanor was unmoved. "No, David, this is exactly the place. You see, I've been humiliated for months while you two have carried on in secret. Tonight, I want everyone to know the truth. I deserve that much." People had stopped their conversations, craning their necks to catch snippets of the scandal unfolding. Eleanor held her head high, refusing to be the silent, suffering wife. David glanced around, his calm exterior cracking, but Eleanor didn't give him the chance to retreat. She turned on her heel, her dignity intact, while the reunion buzzed with gasps and murmurs. The truth was out in the open now, a raw wound laid bare. And as Eleanor walked away from the marriage she'd once believed would last a lifetime, she felt the weight of betrayal finally lifting. In the wreckage of that night, Eleanor found her freedom, leaving David behind to face the consequences of his choices amidst the shattered remains of his carefully constructed life. Eleanor walked briskly out of the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she exited the scene of her own painful triumph. She felt liberated, yet raw and exposed. The surge of confidence from confronting David and Suzanne was already beginning to fade, leaving behind the ache of betrayal. But she refused to look back. She had spent years holding herself together in his shadow, and tonight was the last time she would stand there. In the lobby, Eleanor paused, leaning against a marble column to steady herself. She could still hear the faint murmur of shocked voices from the ballroom. She knew they were talking about her, about David, about the scandal that had just torn open in the middle of a supposedly joyful reunion. She could only imagine how David would spin this later, likely with excuses and attempts to win her back, or, more likely, save face. But Eleanor was done with pretense, done with damage control. After a few moments, the heavy glass doors of the ballroom swung open, and footsteps echoed across the empty lobby. Eleanor didn't need to look up to know it was David. His scent, his hurried breathing, and his familiar way of trying to appear composed when he was anything but, gave him away. "Eleanor," he called softly, careful not to raise his voice. "Please, can we talk?" She straightened, turning to face him. His face looked desperate, weary, as if he had aged years in the span of minutes. He reached for her hand, but she drew back, her expression icy. "You want to talk now, David? After lying to me for months?" she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "After humiliating me in front of everyone we know?" David took a deep breath, his gaze dropping in shame. I never meant for this to happen. Eleanor, it was a mistake. I was weak. It was just nostalgia, that's all. Seeing Suzanne again after all these years, it brought back memories." "Memories?" Eleanor's voice wavered, between laughter and anger. "You mean it brought back a part of yourself that you were willing to throw away everything we built together for?" "It wasn't like that," he insisted, his voice desperate. "I love you, Eleanor. She was just a distraction." Her lips tightened, a bitter laugh escaping before she could stop it. "A distraction? That's what you call breaking our marriage vows for some memories?" She shook her head, bitterness washing over her. "David, I am done being a mere fixture in your life. You don't get to insult my intelligence by calling this a distraction." David's face fell, but then his voice grew defensive. "You don't understand, Eleanor. I've been under so much pressure, the career, the expectations, everything. And she reminded me of a time when things were simpler." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and she spoke in a low, even voice. "And what exactly am I, David? Am I the weight that made your life so hard?" He started to respond, but no words came. The reality of her words seemed to settle heavily upon him, and for once, he was left speechless. Eleanor let out a slow breath, feeling the tension release as her own decision became clear. "You know, David, I thought we were a team. But now, I see that I've been holding up the weight of this marriage alone. The elevator chimed, and Eleanor saw Suzanne emerge, her face drawn, her eyes widening at the sight of them. She lingered at a distance, as if unsure whether to join the conversation or retreat. David shot a pained look in her direction, but Eleanor seized her chance. "Why don't you go to her, David?" she said, her tone cold. "I think you two have plenty to discuss." She turned to leave, heading toward the main doors. As she reached for the handle, she stopped, looking back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I hope she's worth losing everything, because I'm not coming back." Eleanor stepped out into the night, the cool air bracing against her skin as she left him behind in the lobby. She didn't look back, didn't falter. Her heart felt heavy, but as she moved forward, step by step, she could feel it growing lighter. She wasn't walking away from her past. She was stepping into a future that, for the first time in years, felt like her own. And as for David, left standing alone in the empty hotel lobby, the weight of his choices would haunt him longer than any words could. Eleanor's parting words echoed in his mind, and he realized that this wasn't a mere confrontation he could sweep under the rug. This was the start of a new chapter, one without her, and one he had foolishly, recklessly brought upon himself. The cool night air washed over Eleanor as she strode purposefully through the hotel's grand entrance. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp breeze fill her lungs and steady her racing heart. The confrontation was over, and so was her marriage. As Eleanor walked toward her car, she felt an odd combination of sadness and clarity, a strange bittersweet relief. For years, she had lived in David's world, following his rules, trusting his promises. She had dedicated her life to supporting him, building a family and a future together, believing in the person she thought he was. And yet, the entire foundation had been a mirage, a picture he had painted to hide his own selfish desires. Tonight, she had seen through it all, and she was done. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her reverie. She turned to see Suzanne standing a few steps away, her face painted with regret and a hint of defiance. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression impassive, refusing to show even a flicker of emotion. "Eleanor," Suzanne began hesitantly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of distant traffic. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. This just happened. It's not what you think." Eleanor raised a hand, silencing her. "You don't have to explain," she said calmly. "In fact, I'd prefer it if you didn't. Whatever you and David shared was built on lies, just like my marriage. It's not me you should be apologizing to." Suzanne's shoulders slumped, and she looked down, guilt mingling with embarrassment. "I didn't want it to end like this," she murmured. "It didn't end like this because of you," Eleanor replied, her voice softer than she intended. "It ended because he chose deception over honesty. He made a choice I can't forgive." Eleanor took one last look at Suzanne, noting the tired lines on her face, the fragility behind her confident facade. Perhaps they were both victims of David's charm, his need to feel young and adored again. But Eleanor refused to let herself pity Suzanne. She had allowed herself to be pulled into his orbit, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Without another word, Eleanor turned away, crossing the parking lot to her car. She could feel Suzanne's gaze on her back, but she didn't turn around. She climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel, and let out a long, steady breath. As she drove home, the realization settled over her. She was free. For the first time in years, she wasn't tethered to David's expectations, his needs, his ambitions. The weight of her marriage, once comforting but now stifling, was finally gone. The future ahead was hers, and hers alone. Back at the house, the one she had poured her heart into making a home for them both, Eleanor walked through each room in silence. Memories lingered in every corner, snapshots of happier times that now felt like hollow illusions. She knew that staying here would only prolong the pain, trapping her in the shadows of a life that no longer existed. That night, she packed a suitcase, gathering only what she truly needed. She left a note on the kitchen counter, simple and to the point. David, I'm leaving this house to you, along with the life we shared. I hope you find what you're looking for, but you won't find it with me. Eleanor. With one last glance around, she stepped out the front door, locking it behind her. She got into her car and drove into the night, feeling the weight of her old life slip away with every mile. The dawn began to break over the horizon as Eleanor reached the coast, the first glimmers of sunlight dancing on the waves. She parked by the shore, stepping out onto the sand and watching as the sky turned from purple to orange, washing the world in new light. It felt symbolic, as if the world were telling her that this was her chance to begin again, to rebuild a life not defined by someone else's choices, but by her own. As the sun rose higher, Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the warmth spread over her face. She thought of all the possibilities awaiting her, the freedom, the independence, the chance to reclaim her dreams and passions. The pain of betrayal lingered, but it no longer defined her. She had a future that was her own, a blank page waiting to be written on her terms. Eleanor smiled to herself, feeling stronger than she had in years. She had lost her marriage, but she had found something far more precious, herself. And in that quiet moment, as the waves rolled against the shore, she knew she was finally free.